My name is Amr Hamzawy. I am a senior scholar at the Center on Democracy at Stanford University, and I work as a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Let me welcome all of you to a panel discussion on Egypt faces a pandemic, a discussion on politics, rights, and global dynamics. We are privileged to have three excellent speakers, experts of Egypt. Mai El-Sadany, who is the managing director of the Tahrir Institute in Washington, D.C., and an expert on legal issues. Mai has been writing a lot in recent years on Egyptian legal changes, on questions of rights and freedoms in Egypt. Welcome, Mai, and thank you so much for joining us. We're privileged to have Khaled Mansour, an independent writer and a consultant on human rights issues. Welcome, Khaled. Glad to have you and great to see you. We're also privileged to have Wahid Hanna. Michael is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation in New York, and Michael has been writing on Egyptian politics following changes, events, shifts in Egyptian politics throughout the last years. Michael, thank you so much for joining us and for having time to join us. Our discussion today is streamed to everyone. It's part of everyone who is interested, of course, in following the discussion. The recording will be available on the YouTube channel of the Carnegie Middle East program. This panel discussion on Egypt faces the pandemic, questions of politics, rights, and global dynamics is part of a series which began last week and which will extend to next week, 3 panels. The first panel took place last week covering public health issues, public health challenges. And a third panel is taking place next week to discuss Egypt, how Egypt is facing the pandemic amid wider crises, be it the issue of water resources and the developments with regard to the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, or different regional and international challenges which Egypt has been facing throughout the last years. So that's what we're doing today. We're focusing on a discussion of state government responses to the pandemic, impacts on politics, impacts on rights, and impacts on questions of citizens' trust, civil society, and how civil society has been responding to the challenges of the pandemic. Let me, if Mai and Khaled agree, let me start by going to you, Michael, and asking you to share with us whether you see the pandemic has been having, whether you see the pandemic has been having any impacts on Egyptian politics. Of course, it's a short-term phenomenon so far, as trying, as challenging as the pandemic may be. It began to unfold a few months ago, so we're clearly referring to short-term changes and shifts, if any. So I would like to get your take on it. Are we seeing any political changes?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for having this discussion. I think the big unknown, and this is a variable the world over, is the course of the disease itself. It's hard to make firm predictions about what is going to happen when we really are still quite ignorant about transmission and the scale of outbreak. And so it remains obviously a difficult proposition. But we can see, I think, 3 distinct approaches, 3 phases to the response of the Egyptian government to the pandemic so far. And I think it's interesting maybe just to lay them out quickly. First, when in February, when cases began to emerge in Egypt among tourists, there was a quite defensive reaction by the regime. There was a widespread assumption, because of past approaches to crises, which are generally focused on obfuscation, repression of dissenting voices, that in fact the pandemic and the outbreak was happening in Egypt at a much greater to a much greater degree. There's a lack of testing. a sense that the government was at that point prioritizing protection of the tourism sector as opposed to focusing on public health. We also saw at that time the effective expulsion of a foreign correspondent who was talking about the potential for much greater numbers. And so that early phase is characterized by this generalized and understandable suspicion of the Sisi regime based on past practice. And of course, it turned out really that the pandemic and the outbreak itself was fairly contained at that early juncture. This is the kind of thing that no authoritarian regime can simply hide. And obviously we're seeing that now as we are in what I imagine is the kind of third phase of this progression. The second phase coincided with outbreak within the senior ranks of the Sisi regime, within the security sector itself. And I think this was a great alarm for the regime. Publicly, we saw 2 senior generals pass away from the virus. And based on other conversations I've had, I'm led to believe that the outbreak within the senior sectors of the regime was much, much wider than has been publicly reported so far. And obviously, at that point, something interesting happens, which is President Sisi basically disappears from public view for several weeks. The prime minister steps forward and as the government is starting to take this more seriously, the prime minister is really the face of Egyptian governance at that point, which breaks with really years-long concentration of power within the office of the presidency. So, despite taking this more seriously, Egypt never went on full lockdown. It's not clear that that would have been advisable in any case. We're seeing this in many low-income countries, but balancing the costs of the economic pain of that kind of measure. But they seem to be taking it seriously, but there's no way to overcome decades of neglect of the public health sector in a matter of weeks. This is a fragile, under-resourced sector. You cannot take steps to overcome that kind of neglect in a matter of weeks. And so, the time bought by this kind of partial curfew, it's not clear that the government and the regime, the Egyptian regime, did much with it to prepare. I think we're out of that second phase now. And I would just add that, as the outbreak seemed tempered, there was a great deal of speculation about why this was the case. And this wasn't just Egypt, this was the case in many low-income countries, a sense that perhaps demographics, climate, past vaccination regimes with TB and others maybe was producing a kind of special or unique kinds of resilience in these kinds of countries that might make them less susceptible to the virus. And obviously that seems like a kind of senseless search for patterns that probably don't exist. And which brings us now to this kind of current phase when clearly transmission is increasing. It's increasing at a kind of official level. We've had ministers saying that the official numbers are likely an undercount. Interestingly, as it's taken a higher toll, it has taken a higher toll on healthcare workers who have become increasingly vocal. And I think, it is notable to see the doctor syndicate being quite critical in public. There is a kind of rising alarm among the healthcare sector and more broadly, particularly in Cairo. We hear things anecdotally, we read things beyond just the official numbers. It's clear that the health sector is under stress and is quite fragile. In response to that stress, the Sisi regime has reverted to past practice. And we now see reports that physicians who have been trying to kind of ring the alarms at the lack of preparation and protection afforded to healthcare workers have been detained. And so this is past practice. This is the approach of the regime to previous crises, to obfuscate what is happening, to suppress dissent. And I would just say that it's not clear to me, and I'll end here, it's not clear to me that that approach is going to work in this case. This is an outbreak that is growing. We don't know if this is at its peak, but what we do know is that it is a very serious specter for the country, and it is affecting people across class boundaries. This is not something that is focused on lower classes only. In fact, at the initial stages, it seemed to be impacting those who actually travel more freely and more frequently. In any case, I am not sure that the Sisi regime, faced with this kind of societal crisis that crosses class boundaries, can simply repress away its opponents, who in many ways are not focused solely on the politics of the moment per se. All dissent is political in this context, but are really focused on the public health response. And I think that's something that we will continue to see. I would just one addendum here, and that is that there has not been a course correction in Egyptian politics since the coup, and there hasn't been a kind of return to any kind of normalcy. The ratchet only increases in one direction. We saw some internal reshuffling following the protests in the fall, clearly some internal friction at that time, and yet the outward-facing approach of the regime remains constant. We haven't seen any kind of major releases of detainees and prisoners, and so this really is the constant in terms of how the Sisi regime is approaching politics writ large and this crisis specifically.
Thank you so much, Michael. So I'm very, very interesting remarks. Before coming to you, Mai, let me just highlight your reference, Michael, to past and new practices. So you're saying past practices are noticeable in the handling of the crisis, be it how the government is dealing with the syndicate of medical doctors, and that there are new elements, primarily the front seats, which are taken by the cabinet, by technocratic members of the cabinet, the prime minister and other members of the cabinet. So we probably will come back to that and see whether it represents a shift within the executive branch of government in Egypt, within the system, from the presidency to the cabinet. Does it tell us a bit more about balance or imbalance between civilians in the cabinet as opposed to representatives of military and security institutions, and whether we're seeing a bit of politics being reintroduced to Egyptian formal spaces via that contestation between the syndicate and the cabinet, because the government did not only detain some, but they made concessions of financial nature as well, and increased levels of precautions, and there were grand announcements which were made by the prime minister in recent days. But we'll come back to that later. Mai, if I can get your response to a question which Michael touched upon, whether the pandemic is having impacts on the situation of freedom of expression, of human rights in Egypt. There were some changes which were introduced to the emergency law recently. There are different interpretations of what the changes mean. I personally tend to see them as basically enabling the prime minister to decree measures. Others tend to see them in a different way. So can I get your take on the impact of the pandemic, short term, of course, on the rights and freedom situation in Egypt?
Sure. Thank you, Amr, for moderating, and thank you, Carnegie, for hosting me. Before I answer your question, I just want to take a moment to mourn and send my condolences to the loved ones of the late Egyptian activist Sarah Higazi. In addition to the immense impact she had on the LGBT space, she was a strong voice on the rights issues that we'll be talking about today. To answer your question, though, from a rights perspective in Egypt, I will say COVID, I think, has done two primary things. It's given us a window into how authoritarian control has been consolidated for years now in Egypt, and it's shown us exactly how this authoritarian structure is leveraged in a moment of global emergency. So in my opinion, it's not necessarily that we're seeing an immense amount of new legislation or creation of new policies in the rights space. These structures and the gaps have existed for years now. It's really that we're seeing how the system fails its population from a rights perspective on a much more massive scale. And I want to focus my answer on three primary political rights issues, and perhaps we can touch on some of the others later. But control of information, due process, and emergency powers. In recent years, we've really seen a significant amount of legislation, prosecutions, attempt to control and really streamline the narrative, whether you're looking at the 2018 media and cybercrime laws, the spike in prosecutions for folks on false news charges, increasing state control of the media, or the continued crackdown on CSOs, academia, press, anyone who's really producing information. At the same time, in Egypt, you don't have a freedom of information legal structure or a way for citizens to learn what authorities are up to unless the authorities choose to share certain information. And so you can imagine that amid pandemic, at a time when information can actually help millions moderate their behavior and assuage panic, access to information is particularly critical. I will say, of course, that Egyptian authorities, they have been reporting on numbers daily. They have been holding press conferences, and they have set up websites and tools to provide information about the pandemic. And I don't want to get into right now the accuracy of numbers or issues of disinformation, because those are topics that could have their own panel, really. But I do want to hone in on the fact that when information has come out that doesn't fit into the narrative presented by the government, rather than respond or issue corrections, the government response has been heavy-handed. And we saw this with the example Michael pointed to, deporting a Guardian journalist, covering alternate projections rather than issuing a rebuttal, prohibiting all visits to prisons rather than creating a safe virtual alternative for families to really check in on their loved ones and access information, arresting individuals who put out social media content on COVID, whether that's lawyers who might be engaging on what's happening among pretrial detainees, or doctors who are documenting a lack of PPE. So switching gears a bit to due process and prisons, I would say, looking at what's been happening since 2013, we've been seeing the access to justice become really more and more tenuous because of a result of a number of things, but including legislation implicating the independence of the judiciary, the rise of entities like the Supreme State Security Prosecution, an over-reliance on pretrial detention as a measure. And this has really given us a detention system where prison facilities are overcrowded, detention renewals are sort of the norm, and there's been a spike accordingly because the system is so pressured. There's been a spike in access to inadequate medical care, deaths in detention. So you have this penal system that has evolved and that's developed that isn't really meant to reform behavior or make victims whole, but rather it's meant to punish for the sake of punishment. And I think during pandemic, we've seen just the challenges of how this system plays out and how these due process violations have been magnified. So obviously, despite the immense amount of risk you could envision if COVID were to spread in Egyptian jails and how this would threaten both the prison population and the population as a whole, Egyptian authorities have dragged their feet when it comes to mass or temporary releases, even though that is the primary recommendation from the WHO when it comes to combating COVID in detention. Despite the fact also that countries in the region have released folks in the thousands, whether you're looking at Bahrain, Morocco, Iran, I could go on and on. And when Egypt finally did issue a pardon for prison releases, it was on the occasion of Sinai Liberation Day. There was zero mention of the pandemic. And of course, it carved out exceptions for political prisoners, protesters, as we're wont to see. And so now we're in a place where we're actually starting to see reports on social media that there could be cases of COVID in a number of different jails. The problem is there's no way to verify those cases, which creates even more panic. And instead of responding or sharing maybe what they're doing to protect prisoners, authorities are refusing to engage with family members, and they're not verifying or commenting on these claims, again, creating more panic in the process. And when we look at the court system, we've seen similar violations. When COVID hit, of course, court sessions were ultimately suspended for what became a 2-month period. And so this meant that the many thousands of folks who were kept in pretrial detention were kept there illegally without review. And instead of authorities thinking to order temporary releases or to use that 2-month period to set up virtual or video court sessions, as other countries like the UAE, Tunisia have done, when courts did resume, what we saw is that renewals were conducted on paper without lawyers present, without detainees being transferred or brought before the court, again, furthering some of the root due process issues that we had been seeing for years now. And then finally, turning to your question about emergency powers. Egypt watchers know that the country has had a long history, obviously, with the state of emergency. And most recently, it's been already in an effectively continuous state of emergency since April 2017. And when the country is in this state, the provisions of the emergency law kick into effect, which can mean emergency court prosecutions, extended surveillance and monitoring, ability to impose curfews. And out of all the rights issues I flagged so far, I will say this is one of the few areas we've seen active legislating or the creation of new policies. And we saw toward the end of April, Egypt's emergency law was in fact amended. Two big things I think to take away here. The first is that 18 new authorities were added to the president's mandate during a state of emergency, from suspending schools to restricting public demonstrations to delaying the payment of gas bills. And the second thing is that the state of emergency expanded the role of the military prosecution in a way that could facilitate its involvement both in investigating and prosecuting crimes during the state of emergency. We have yet to see exactly how this amended emergency law will apply, so I don't want to guess. But I will say that there's certainly concern from a legal perspective, both about expanding the powers of the military judicial system, because we have data that says it's a system that doesn't offer due process protections that would normally be afforded to citizens. And of course, on the 18 authorities added to the president's power, they may seem important in this moment of pandemic or necessary. The question, though, is that these authorities will continue to be in the emergency law forever unless amended. And so when we have states of emergencies that arise out of different contexts, not health related, query if these powers are going to be necessary and proportionate as they should be. So to sum up, in answering your question, Amr, you have a rights context where Egypt is not necessarily creating new mechanisms implicating rights, but rather existing and relying on its infrastructure, its existing infrastructure. And it's just that now we're seeing the extent to which this infrastructure can be used and how it's affecting, I would say, a much larger chunk of the population. I'll stop here and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Mai, so much. Let me move to you, Khaled, and thank you so much for your patience. So, Khaled, you've been working with and on civil society in Egypt for several years now, and you've been following developments with regard to freedom of expression in Egypt. So I would love to get your input as well on whether a pandemic and state responses, government responses to the pandemic are impacting changes with regard to freedom of expression and with regard to what civil society organizations have been able to do in Egypt since the outbreak in January, February 2020.
Thank you very much, Amr. Thank you for having me. As you rightly said at the beginning, this is such a short period of time. But despite the fact that we have unprecedented conditions globally speaking, I think we have precedented behavior by the government, or really accentuated or heightened trends that we have seen over many years of authoritarianism, unaccountable and sometimes inexplicable repressive policies that you don't know what would be the objective or the value of having them. But also to have one positive aspect in an otherwise bleak picture, that against all odds, or maybe because of them, we have had some vibrant and active civil society moves, especially in service provisions. And it's because of them, largely because since state services are declining and since state policies are causing much poverty, then civil society has really stepped up to fill in a lot of gaps. Now, also probably some of the negative trends that my co-panelists have spoken about have increased since people or stakeholders domestically or outside the country are busy worrying about their lives and the lives of loved ones and their people and their constituencies, that they wouldn't engage even in a social media campaign against human rights violations that much. So hunger strikes, for example, don't generate a lot of domestic or foreign interest as they used to do. Now, in terms of freedom of expression, the problem is with COVID-19 that so far one cannot write freely without the risk of having a legal backlash, even on social media platforms. So Facebook posts have taken a few people to prison on serious charges. Several journalists, at least 3, have been arrested after they wrote critically about COVID-19 and government policies. At least 5 doctors who expressed their views on professional issues or professional concerns or were critical of state policies were also arrested. So in a way, social media, which is the only remaining platform for people to articulate their positions or their views, have become a sort of a trap, including platforms such as TikTok. And as we see in pandemics or such huge public health emergencies, the moralistic and conservative wing usually gains traction. And we know about a couple of women who have been arrested for undermining family values with their videos. And it's not only Trump who's holding the Bible in front of the White House. I mean, you've seen a lot of, at least on social media, public backlash, conservative and what have you. Now, the problem with curtailing freedom of expression is that in a country where politics is eviscerated, at least formal politics is really empty, the arena, and in a country where the mass media is largely controlled by government or pro-government interests, people are, one, kept in the dark about what's really happening, and 2, government doesn't have much of a feedback about their performance and what they are doing. 3, mistakes are covered up or uncovered. So if you have about 73 doctors, according to the last count, that died because of COVID-19, which is many folds the percentage you have in countries that have been suffering much higher numbers of infections, like Italy. It's like maybe 4 or 5 times more than Italy. Then there is a serious issue. But if you have doctors arrested because they speak about personal protective equipment, then you do have an issue, because you will never know as a policymaker, if you would like to know, what's really happening on the ground. And with the absence of an energetic or engaged parliament in general, social media has become probably the only space that people can resort to, so they can discuss life and death matters and voice their concerns, needs, and indeed criticism. But instead of working with people trying to respond to some of these, then we have either state or pro-government voices, even in campaigns, rehashing the old stuff about the problem is people are ignorant, people are not wearing masks, as if all people with a country of 33% poverty rate can afford all these medical measures, or people are not socially isolating or taking distance from each other, as those voices tend to forget how densely populated some of the neighborhood, that sometimes it's better to socially isolate yourself in the street rather than back at home. I mean, at the end of the day, policies seem to be, for an outsider, very opaque and whimsical. They are decided or shaped by the prerogatives or the needs of social control without a recourse for the people who suffer most. I mean, who is talking on behalf of the poor or the patients or the doctors or the medical staff and getting a listening ear from the government or the state side? Now, we have seen from the very varied policies around the globe to address the pandemic, from open Sweden to totally under curfew countries like Jordan, that there's no one scientific way to handle this pandemic, that public health policies are ultimately political. And you cannot have politics without having people speaking about their views. So in Egypt, as in all other countries, decisions were taken, for example, on how to assign limited medical resources, how to balance the economic losses with public health needs. Who pays the price? What about the poor? I mean, all these decisions are ultimately political, not scientific, only not medical, and definitely not to be decided by one minister or one president. So I think my main concern about the crackdown on freedom of expression is that it does deprive people from a channel to voice their concerns. It does deprive the government from a way to understand better what's happening on the ground, and that's why nobody really understands what's happening. Anecdotally, you hear horror stories in terms of numbers.
Khaled, we're not able to hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please. So if you do not mind repeating, I suspect the last two sentences.
I mean, basically, I was trying to stress why freedom of information and expression is really important for policymakers, for politics, for policy formation, and for people to regain some trust in a government that they have lost all confidence in.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Khaled. So let me before coming to you, Michael, in the second round of conversation among you panelists, let me remind everyone who is following us that they can raise questions. They can send written questions, which I will receive and direct to our panelists today. I will try to bundle questions as a moderator and pass them to our panelists for responses, input, comments. Michael, let me push you a bit more on sort of that duality of past and new elements in the government response in Egypt to the pandemic. And so if you would compare the current crisis, and the pandemic does represent a crisis, not only a public health crisis, as Khaled was mentioning, it's an economic, it's a social, it's a public health issue. It's ultimately a political crisis as well. So when you compare the government handling of the current crisis to previous crises since 2013, be it, for example, the ongoing crisis of the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia and the handling of it, or the two-island deal between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, or the government did have a contentious relationship with the Syndicate of Medical Doctors and the Syndicate of Journalists in 2015 and 16. So there were different crises which were challenging for the political system in Egypt. Are you seeing, when you compare the handling of the current crisis to previous crises, are you seeing, if even a slight shift toward more transparency? Is the nature of the current crisis imposing a higher level of transparency? And I'm referring to what Mai was saying regarding the daily press conferences, issuing daily statements, primarily by the cabinet, by the prime minister and relevant ministers. So secondly, when I look at the balance or division of labor between the presidency and the cabinet, are you seeing shifts as well? It's not only about the presidency taking a back seat or not shaping the state response from a front seat, but the cabinet is using even the emergency powers, which Mai was referring to. I mean, these powers have been used once and again by the Prime Minister to decree measures, all the way from curfew regulations into closure of schools and universities and so on and so forth. Are we seeing a bit of a different division of labor than the one which we've been seeing since 2013? Is the cabinet empowered? Are civilian voices and ministers in the cabinet empowered? How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would start with the discussion about transparency. And I go back to other contexts, right? So not just Egypt. We looked at the first, if we look at the first country in the region that suffered a mass outbreak, Iran, also a quite authoritarian context. And similarly, an effort to give some sense of the scope of disease in the country. And I go back to an earlier comment. I don't think that disease amidst a pandemic can be hidden, right? So I don't think this is a function of choice, that there is a knowing shift toward transparency. I think this is a function of necessity. You cannot hide these numbers. And obviously these numbers are, for a variety of reasons, mostly having to do with testing capacity that are not unique to Egypt. These numbers are an undercount. And if you have people in cities and villages who can't have their loved ones admitted to a hospital, if you have a young doctor with COVID who dies in his own home because his family can't find an ICU bed for him, again, it's too widespread. It is not just an Egypt story, it is a global story, and it is affecting people throughout the society. So, I don't think that this reflects a kind of conscious choice towards greater transparency. I think this is a function of necessity. They have no other option but to at least try to communicate some information about the state of the disease in the country. And I think that this function of necessity flows into your second question about division of labor. I think there are real questions about the kind of initial move to the forefront of the prime minister. It came at a time when President Sisi effectively disappeared from public life in a very conspicuous way that produced a great deal of speculation as to why, and I think understandably so. But it also reflects the fact that there has been such great concentration of power and focus on Sisi and the office of the presidency that when he disappears from public life, it's not immediately clear, other than the prime minister, who could possibly step forward to kind of fill that void. But obviously, the prime minister did take a much more public role. The minister of health has been a much more public voice. And again, I do think this is a function of necessity. These are not things that I think that the office of the presidency is well equipped to deal with. I don't necessarily think that they represent at the moment, a major shift in a kind of approach to governance. But what I would say is that they might have a real impact on the balance of powers, depending on how this crisis unfolds, particularly in terms of length. If this becomes a crisis that lasts months and years, and we see other parts of the government taking on a more public role, I think it is very possible that it has some impact, again, out of necessity. But I don't think that we're seeing a kind of conscious decision on the part of the office of the presidency and Sisi himself to really remake the way that government functions in Egypt.
Thank you, Michael, so much. Mai, so you mentioned in your reference to the rights, to the human rights situation in Egypt. You mentioned that Egypt the government in Egypt has not been legislating or issuing or passing new laws, but it's been primarily using existing laws in terms of its management of the pandemic, as it pertains to freedom of expression and as it pertains to questions of human rights. to what extent do you see Egypt fitting in a wider global setting? I mean, is Egypt any different from undemocratic countries, be it all the way from Hungary in Europe to different cases in Asia, Africa, and Latin America? Are we looking at an Egyptian specificity, or are we simply looking at how undemocratic governments normally respond in moments of crises to social, economic, public health challenges?
Thank you. Honestly, I would say it's a bit of both, because you're seeing Egypt, it's obviously not unusual that authoritarian governments would already have laws curtailing protest, freedom of expression, poor freedom of information laws. But Egypt is, I would say, ahead of the curve on some of this legislation. It has multiple laws that you can use to crack down on false news charges, for example. It has multiple laws to silence particular organizing and activities. So I think in as much as that is different, there's more tools in the toolbox, even if they're being achieved towards the same purpose. Other countries in the region have similar legislation, but it maybe had not been widely exercised and used, I think, to the degree that we had been seeing in Egypt, particularly in the last few years. And I would say, I'll give you, not necessarily in the legislation space, but I'll give you again, I strike the example of Egypt, comparing Egypt to other countries in the MENA region. Even authoritarian governments in the MENA region, including Iran, released tens of thousands of prisoners in the wake of COVID because they recognized the severity of the health crisis at hand. Egypt, on the other hand, did not take action. And in fact, we were tracking this, and there are tens of countries in the region that had issued by the time Egypt finally engaged on this issue, thousands of releases. And so I think there's this slowing down and dragging of its feet that you're seeing that is a little bit unique to the Egyptian context. And I think that's important to note. And similarly, again, in the example that I pointed to with the court sessions, the fact is that even authoritarian governments or governments in the region with authoritarian tendencies were able to transition to virtual court sessions because they recognized the need to hear trials, if you will. Egypt did not. It took a 2-month period sitting on its feet effectively and not coming up with an alternative response. So I think while you did see, like Michael had been saying, a sort of it's not a conscious choice, and I very much agree with that, but out of necessity, the areas where I think Egypt has felt that it doesn't need to make changes have been particularly underscored in the prison spaces, where I think there is still an understanding that we don't need to act or we don't need to provide transparency in this space because it's still in their assessment a marginal or a niche issue. Similarly with the court and judicial system, it's kind of using the little bit of it's using the attention that you might be getting on the health, economic issues, the issues that are often viewed as more pressing, and maybe providing little wins here and there, or being a little bit more proactive, but it's very much kind of slowing its feet and not recognizing how the political rights might be related to the economic and health, and they certainly are.
Right. So thank you, Mai. In fact, there are a few indications from the cabinet that they do look at the public health challenge represented by the pandemic, not separately or not in a separated fashion from the social and economic challenges. So the cabinet, the prime minister established a working group, which is in a way very similar to the division of labor between the presidency and the prime minister. They established, it's like a return to pre-2011 Egypt, to the last years under former President Mubarak, the interplay between the Ahmed Nazif government and the presidency back then. The Prime Minister established an interesting working group where he has different ministers representatives of the private sector and a few NGOs to look at the social and economic impact of the pandemic. And that working group is meeting, if I'm not mistaken, every 2 weeks in the Prime Minister's office. And in a way, it's a return to what the Egyptian government does know or did knew before 2011 as well, sense of a limited, not only staged, but limited engagement with civil society. And with that, I go to you, Khaled, because you said that maybe one of the positive outcomes so far of the handling of the pandemic is the role of civil society. I was, before coming to the panel, I was reading, looking at two sets of surveys, public opinion surveys, one conducted by the Princeton project, the Arab Barometer, and a second one conducted by Markaz Basira, which is a local center for public opinion polls in Egypt. And in the two sets regarding Egypt and regarding trust of citizens in government institutions as opposed to civil society, up until January 2020, February 2020, the government and government institutions have been scoring relatively not only relatively, actually way better than civil society institutions. The government in the Egyptian government handling of different crises, different challenges, according to the Arab Barometer, has been positively rated up to 70%, 68, 69%. In Basira, up to 80% in specific sectors, electricity, oil, petroleum, what have you. And civil society is down in recent surveys and polls to maybe, in terms of trust, citizens' trust, to less than 10%. Now, you said that you see it as a positive trend that civil society is engaging. Can you reflect a bit more of that? What is civil society doing, and how can it operate in an environment as tight as the Egyptian environment for civil society organizations?
Thank you, Amr. Since I've been close to some of these surveys and how they get conducted, it makes a huge difference to ask somebody in Egypt about non-governmental organizations, which has been really vilified and compared to the devil, or civil society organizations, or charity organizations, all of which are actually maybe have the same legal form or various legal forms, but engage in the same thing. I mean, the main difference is between service provision organizations, which I think if they are asked about it, it will show a different numbers from advocacy organizations, which are very few, and they have been under tremendous pressure, either in human rights or any other policy advocacy issues. So that's one important point to keep in mind. Running surveys which are by law criminalized if you don't have a large number of approvals, endorsements, including an endorsement for your own survey, questions one after the other, and engaging with a government body to do that are, to say the least, a bit dubious exercise to trust the results. Having said that, a lot of what we discussed, me and Mai and maybe Michael, was about the lack of information, real information in the function of freedom of exchange of information, and not because of necessity. You don't really have that. So we lean and we count on anecdotal evidence based on our long experience of having engaged with civil society, or talking to families, or talking to a large number of people to understand who is helping whom. I can tell you that an organization like Mirsal, for example, that was little known before this pandemic, is the first name that comes to mind on all social media if you do a search of an organization that Egyptians will donate to, or they donated to help victims of COVID-19. Many other organizations I spoke to in the last 2-3 weeks have spoken about how the Ministry of Social Solidarity has become not really lax, because the law is really ambiguous and vague, but they have become less obstructionist, if you like, especially when it comes, again, to charity or service provision by civil society organizations. The fact that people are helping each other even without organizations. So you have groups and networks of people in villages raising funds or donating to people who are not working. I mean, the issue we did not talk about in this session so far is the huge economic suffering of maybe a third of the population. I just edited a report about poor single women in slums in Cairo and how they are faring under the pandemic. It's horrendous what's happening to them, not only violence at home and extreme poverty and resorting to desperate measures. And these have only one recourse, which is public solidarity and civil society organizations.
Great. Thank you so much, Khaled. So thank you, Mai, Michael, and Khaled for your remarks. And we've been receiving questions from your viewers. And I would like to pass the questions to you, depending on what I see you're interested in responding to, but please, anyone feel free to jump in. Even if I'm directing a question to Michael and Khaled, please jump in if you would like to share your insight. So most of the questions we received so far are more or less directed to your remarks, Michael, in the sense of trying to better understand the dynamics between the government on the one hand and the syndicate of medical doctors, and whether we are looking at new pattern and emerging pattern of contestation or dissent, or whether it's basically a confirmation of what we've been seeing since 2013. Some groups which do represent collective interest, be it the Syndicate of Medical Doctors or the Journalist Syndicate or others, would try to push for their own members' interests. I mean, they are not addressing wider political issues. It's, as you said, it's about protection of medical doctors and medical teams while performing their duties, which all Egyptians and all human beings actually appreciate, or have come to appreciate even more since the pandemic began. So is it that we're seeing the government using its traditional mixture of repression and co-optation, or do you see a new pattern of contestation emerging? Is it too early to say so, or what exactly is your take on it? And the second question related to your remarks as well, Michael, is on whether the absence of the presidency, which you were referring to, is related to a calculation on the side of the institution of the presidency, that the presidency should let the cabinet tackle and handle the state response to the pandemic, and basically keep a space for itself. The presidency should keep a space for itself to basically interfere whenever needed, to inject more trust in what the cabinet doing or what the government is doing when needed, which is once again, and here is a sentence from me, which is once again can be seen elsewhere. It can be seen in Russia, it can be seen in different other countries across the globe. So Michael and Khaled and Mai, please feel free to jump in to comment on that too.
Yeah, I mean, they're great questions. And on the first of whether we're seeing a new pattern of contestation, you know, I think since 2011 and particularly since 2013, we want to, we oftentimes analytically fall into the trap of wanting to see the kind of big explosive change, the kind of moment of political rupture when everything changes, because you know, we saw it once, it failed in many ways, and the present reality is a quite grim and incrementally deteriorating one. And so there's often the urge at each juncture to try to read analytically in terms of at the beginning of political change, that this somehow turns a new chapter. We saw this very clearly in the protests in the fall, when I think some analysis really got too far out ahead of what was happening on the ground. That being said, I do think that this crisis is different, because it is not just a public health crisis. It is a global public health crisis. It is an economic crisis. It is a social crisis. And it's not one that is necessarily of short duration. This isn't the islands where you have several days of protests that simply evaporate over time. And so the circumstance is different. Now, whether this contestation produces a kind of different politics, I think, you know, depends on what happens with the disease, what happens with the rate of transmission in Egypt, how affected is Egyptian society. I mean, I think we have to leave open the possibility that things can get worse without creating political openings. That the dramatic negative reversals and the creation of disaffection don't necessarily automatically translate into positive political change. It is not clear what kind of political vehicle could collectivize that kind of disaffection to produce political change in Egypt, because formal political space in terms of political parties and opposition press have been destroyed. And so that's not something that can be recreated overnight. But I do think it's worth considering how these can have an impact that has a kind of a longer term impact, the kind of creation of spaces in which the government is unable to simply crush dissent and opposition, because this is a little different, because this is a public health crisis, because it is impacting doctors, and because it is impacting people across class boundaries. And so, you know, I do think it's worth considering whether this creates a kind of not protected space, but a space in which the regime cannot simply imprison its way out of this kind of crisis. And in terms of the second question, whether this is a calculated step on the part of the president to let the prime minister and the cabinet take the reins as a way to perhaps distance the presidency from potential failure, to create space and to, in some ways, shirk responsibility. I would say I'm not sure, because I'm not totally sure why this initial shift happened in March. Whether this was a function of necessity, and this goes back to the reasons for Sisi's disappearance from public life. And so, you know, depending on why that decision was taken, I think it leads to very, very different conclusions. And so I would say I'm not sure. I think regardless of the initial motivation for the retreat from public life for several weeks, I do think it has had that effect, that it has created another, not center of authority, but at least another authority figure who is active on the public stage alongside other cabinet ministers, and that is new. And so whether the initial motivations were a function of necessity or a kind of calculated approach to try to at least shift the possibilities for blame, I do think, particularly if the duration of this kind of assumption of this role is one that lasts quite a long time, I think it will have impact in terms of how Egypt governs itself.
Right, thank you, Michael. And probably as political scientists, we should be less preoccupied with motivations and intentions and more preoccupied with impacts. And so operational realities, daily realities. And so I'm restricting myself to my role as a moderator, so I'm not interfering, but I'm just commending you for that remark on no matter what the intention is, it's important to keep an eye on what the impact is and what the impact might be. Khaled and Mai, do you like to jump in on and add? Meanwhile, we've received additional questions, but please feel free to jump in if you like to.
I have one quick thing. I just want to underscore something that Michael said about this not necessarily being entirely different, but that we are seeing this stress on the economy, on health, on a larger part of the population. And I think it's important to remember that one of the reasons that authoritarianism has manifested or lasted as long as it has in Egypt is because traditionally it maybe has directly affected a smaller subset of the population. And what's slightly different now is that more and more people are being affected or interacting more regularly in a life or death matter with the failures of the state. And I think that's one important thing to keep in mind, as well as the fact that more and more people are sitting at home, whether it's all day or in the evenings, according to the curfew, and watching the government's every move. And so you have a population that is, for the first time, kind of paying attention in a massive degree and assessing measures that are working and measures that aren't. And I don't know how it will manifest, similar to Michael, but what I can say is that these two things are different, and that a larger portion of the population is being affected and a larger portion of the population is paying attention. So like Michael says, I definitely agree. It's not something that necessarily you can imprison or legislate away.
And if I may
Thank you, Mike. Khaled, please,
if I may add,
go ahead.
We really haven't seen the full economic impact of what happened in the country. I mean, we already sought like $7 billion of extra debt from the international monetary funds. The foreign debt markets or the bond markets are not as easy to tap as they used to be in the past few years. The energy prices are not going up, so our gas income, the promised one, might not materialize soon. And the most important, the remittances, the $26 billion that were sent to Egypt last year by people working overseas will decline. They will decline. There's no way around it. I think we are entering tough times economically, and people might pay, and I'm not sure, but I think people will pay maybe less attention to public health than they do to their pockets and their livelihood, which is becoming more and more difficult for the middle classes in Egypt.
Thank you, Khaled. On that last point, and coming back or staying with you, Khaled. So we have a question on the impacts of Egypt's need for economic and financial, for external financing, the potential impacts of Egypt's strong need for external financing on Egypt's foreign relationships. I mean, do you, and of course, Michael and Mai, please come in if you like to. Khaled, do you expect Egypt to continue its close relationship with the Gulf, even if the Gulf or some Gulf countries can no longer provide that external financial help which is needed in Egypt? Do you anticipate any shifts in Egypt's foreign relationships?
I don't expect any major shifts in that regard. There will be less money for sure coming from, or less grants coming from the Gulf for their own domestic reasons, primarily maybe. But Egypt has a lot of reasons to continue strategic relations with countries like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates beyond the billions of dollars that they received from these countries. The challenge for Egypt in terms of the economy will not be how to wean itself off external financing. It will continue to need external financing, and I understand why. The issue is about expenditure and not external financing. How this money is being spent, on what project, with what objective, and in the lack of an open political discussion, we don't really know. We hear figures, we hear dreams, but the issue is it's going to be tougher and tougher to get money and to get returns on some of these mega projects that we are seeing still being constructed.
Thank you, Khaled. If Mai and Michael have no comments on the question of foreign relationships, we have a question on charity organizations in Egypt, not only charity, on NGOs in Egypt in general, pertaining to the Red Crescent or Red Cross. If you guys are aware of how active the Red Crescent is, the Red Cross is, and are they actively engaged in collecting blood for antibodies in Egypt? That's a question which takes us back to the core of the public health challenge, collection of blood for antibodies. Does any one of you have an insight on the reality of the Red Crescent, Red Cross in Egypt? No. So I myself have been seeing, I mean, to that question, I have been reading news, I guess, like our panelists today and like Egypt Watchers, regarding how the Ministry of Health and Population has centralized collecting blood in order to avoid any manipulation in Egypt. So to my knowledge, it's been centralized. I'm not sure what kind of tools are being used, but blood collection is being centralized and pursued by the Ministry of Health and Population. So let me come back to you panelists with an additional question, primarily to the balance of male and female voices within the cabinet. So, and Michael, since you've been following Egyptian politics and sort of that division of labor between the presidency and the cabinet, what's striking as well, and I'm just reflecting on an earlier discussion I had with some colleagues of mine, and it's not a question which we received. We're still waiting for some questions, hopefully to come. But I just would like you to reflect on whether we're seeing an additional interesting shift within the cabinet, which is as of now presents itself to the public primarily via female voices, female ministers. The Minister of International Cooperation, the Minister of Planning, the Minister of Health and Population, and apart from the Prime Minister, who is a male, and the State Minister for Communication and Media, who is a male minister, it seems the state response seems to be driven primarily by female voices. Do you see that as possibly leading the way into a different gender balance within the Egyptian cabinet?
Yeah, I think it's notable, and anybody who's watched the past few months has seen this kind of more prominent female representation on the public stage. And again, why it has happened is probably much less interesting to than what its potential impact is. And of course, it's not something that's going to have a kind of immediate impact on gender norms and the expectations in society. But it's the kind of thing that over time does change the way that people, understand gender norms, gender expectations, and so, again, I think it's something that will have impact over time. I think there's no question about that.
Thank you, Michael. And let me stay with you. A question which we just received is based on a development that took place recently in Egypt. The upper house of parliament has been re-established by law. So the House of Representatives passed the law to re-establish the upper house of parliament earlier today, if I'm not mistaken, or yesterday. So do you expect legislative elections scheduled for later this year to take place, or do you expect postponement? And what kind of significance would you attach, and Mai and Khaled, please come in as well, would you attach to upcoming parliamentary elections?
So first on whether there'll be elections at all, I think the biggest driver of those kinds of big political events will be the disease itself. Is it possible practically to hold those kinds of nationwide elections without endangering public health? So first, I think that's one major consideration, and it's a big unknown, obviously, that hangs over all of these issues. In terms of the political impact of having an upper house, I mean, Egypt has long wanted to rule by law. We saw this in the Mubarak era, when there was a kind of fastidious following of rules that produced autocratic ends, but a sense that they were following laws. We saw this with succession, with a variety of things, where rules were important to the regime, despite the kind of manifest authoritarian outcomes. And so, I think in some ways, these structures matter much less than the ethos of the ruling regime. And so it's hard to imagine that the addition of an additional legislative body is going to have any kind of appreciable impact on the politics, in which formal political life has been crushed. I mean, that's the entirety of the Sisi regime's political project since 2014 has been to destroy formal political life, and so it's hard to imagine that this makes much of that this has a kind of material impact on political developments.
Okay, Mai and Khaled, any insights? Sure. I would just add that the Senate, creating a Senate, as it's going to be called, I think it's really going to manifest as a second or an additional rubber stamp, depending on how the procedures of the parliament additionally goes. I mean, the upper house is meant to provide advice or consultation, commenting on existing laws, treaties, what have you. And I think there's no reason, like Michael was alluding to believe that we'll see anything different. We already have the example of the House of Representatives with its membership, with its political parties. We have lots of data on where and how laws are initiated. Most laws that are being passed by the House of Representatives are initiated at the cabinet. So they're not MP-driven laws. And I don't see that there have been any changes in the political organizing space to make this any different. I think we're just going to end up with a second body of parliament that is serving the same rubber stamp role and sort of putting another vote of approval, I would say, on legislation that comes from largely the top down.
Thank you, Mai. Khaled?
Yeah, yes, as Michael said, we have in Egypt for a long time have had a fastidious allegiance to rules and forms and how to respect them and make them actually achieve what we want. For me, it seems the Senate is largely a body in which you can reward or give some perks to supporters and cronies. I don't expect it to have any major impact on the political arena.
Okay, so we're running out of time, and I'm sure you guys have been exhausted by questions and by remarks, and so I'm really grateful for all of you. It's not easy still to conduct virtual meetings and to use Zoom for over an hour. So at Stanford, they keep reminding us that the ideal time for a Zoom panel should not exceed an hour, preferably 45 minutes. So we are a bit over an hour, and so we need to wrap up. I have two last questions, which I'm going to give to you and then ask you in a final round briefly to respond to the two questions if you like, and share any closing insights you have. So the two questions. One is on the dynamics of the government and the private sector, whether the expected economic distress might push the government into a search for new compromises with the private sector economically. And a second question on whether philanthropy in Egypt in general has been negatively, or how philanthropy in Egypt has been impacted by recent legislation on NGOs, the law which was passed a few years ago, amended a year ago or a bit more. So the impacts on philanthropy in Egypt, and whether philanthropic organizations have been able to step up in terms of enabling society to better tackle and respond to the pandemic, which is once again reminding everyone and all of us is a global challenge that we're all facing. So let me go to you, Khaled first, followed by Mai, followed by Michael, in a final round of remarks.
Thank you very much, Amr. In terms of the dynamics between the government and the private sector, it was very clear a few days ago when the private sector, the hospital sector or the medical sector has refused to decrease the prices for COVID-19 care. And we're talking about ICUs getting anything between $800 to $1,200 a night. In a country like Egypt, that's a humongous amount. I think with the government also continuing, despite all these circumstances, in its structural adjustment, decreasing subsidies on energy prices, even for the lowest sectors, is also an indication of how the government sees its economic policy and its relationship with the private sector. I think the other point, which is more positive, is the philanthropy. I think the big philanthropies in Egypt are largely behind the changes that happened to the civil association law from 2017 to the new version in 2019. We are talking very quickly about organizations that maybe control or provide probably half the incubators for prematurely born babies in Egypt, that run hospitals, schools, that provide like social services. We are talking about organizations that have hundreds of millions of dollars in annual budget in Egypt. So I think they have become a number to reckon with, and that the government works with them as the entities that will pick the slack that the government is leaving by moving outside social services. And that's why they have much more breathing room than advocacy-based civil society organizations.
Great, thank you, Khaled. Mai?
I'll just add that I think it's important to be reminded or look at the existing infrastructure or the existing relationships that existed prior to COVID, whether it's between the private sector and the government or between civil society and the government. This happened fairly quickly, right? And not many anticipated it. And I think it's important to recognize that it's unlikely that any pre-existing relationships or pre-existing forms will have changed at this point quickly enough to address any challenges. So while there's a positive relationship with charities, that relationship, some charities, that relationship may have pre-existed COVID. If there's limitations or loopholes in the relationship with private sector, again, those pre-existed when it comes to COVID. So I think that whether we see dramatic changes, I don't think so, because in this moment of emergency, much of how the government is responding is very kind of just what's necessary, the limited amount, kind of whatever gets them to the next day, if you will. And I think that will also remain the case, unfortunately, when looking at the rights issues that I had brought up earlier. It will stand to see how the arrest campaigns continue. We'll stand to see the degree of transparency that is afforded. But unfortunately, on both of those fronts, I don't anticipate any large positive diversions from what we're seeing as a negative trend.
Thank you, Michael, you have the final word.
Yeah, just in terms of the government-private sector, just very briefly, you know, we've seen macroeconomic improvements in recent years, but no trickle-down effect. Inequality has grown. The kind of military-led economic project, looking at mega projects, you know, hasn't had positive social impact. So the deficiencies were clear prior to the pandemic. I think you know, it is possible that necessity forces the regime to shift tack, but you know, they haven't so far. They have been very reluctant to, knowing very well that you know, it hasn't produced the desired effects. So you know, it's not something that they will do willingly, but I think it's, you know, depending again on the severity of this crisis. I think it's worth noting that the economic crisis is a global one. There aren't sources of easy financing abroad, and so again, necessity might be the kind of engine for some change in the future.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much, Khaled. Thank you so much, Mai. It was a great pleasure to moderate a panel with you guys, and I'm grateful for all your viewers who shared questions and for silent viewers as well. Let me remind everyone that the series on Egypt facing the pandemic, which is an engagement with Egyptian voices on what has been happening in Egypt politically, economically, and socially, and from a public health perspective, will continue next week with a panel on Thursday tackling enduring crises, be it national security crises, or of course the water crisis, which is a national security crisis, and how Egypt, the Egyptian government and civil society are responding to them. So in that spirit, thank you so much, and looking forward to being engaged in similar discussions soon. Thank you, everyone.